BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. Black Box Ned 88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. So today we're going to be talking all about serial killers. The first thing I would like to say is that we did a previous upload called The Psychology of Serial Killers that we will have available in the description box if you haven't heard it yet. But I would just like to say, I'm fully aware, I am not a scientist. I am not a doctor, I am not a psychologist, but we do explore a lot of things in the true crime world, and it often ties into psychology. We're talking about going through the books, the podcasts, the movies, the documentaries, and trying to learn as much as we can about how people function. And sometimes this deals with serial killers, and as well as just the psychology of true crime in general. So yesterday, I had the opportunity to sit down with a neuroscientist and have a conversation and explore some of the things we've mentioned on the channel, to talk about some of the ideas that we've mentioned, like what does the scientific community think? What do you think personally? And I'm not going to say her last name, but big shout out to Christina. Thank you so much for talking to me about the neuroscience of serial killers and sharing a first-hand input. We got onto this subject because I found out that Christina, as a brain scientist, was also fascinated with serial killers and how they function. And one of the starting points that I would like to give is that I learned that a serial killer, and very specifically, we got many types of the way people act, but if you were to say a psychopathic or sociopathic serial killer uses 5% overall more brain activity than an average functioning person. 5% more. And when I said psychopath, sociopath, and narcissist, like psychopath meaning a person is born that way, sociopath meaning that society or the social surroundings, social environment has caused them to become that way, and narcissist would be a little bit lower on the poll, but all psychopathic and sociopathic individuals are narcissistic. However, not all narcissists are psychopathic or sociopathic, so that's one of the ways that we explore it. So what I would say about that, first and foremost, hearing that a psychopathic serial killer is going to be using 5% more of their brain, or have 5% more brain function than an average ordinary person, I was really quite surprised by that. And I think that, well, first and foremost, I would say Christina shared one thing with me when she was saying that is why a psychopath or a sociopath is so dangerous, because they are using more of their brain than the average person. But I began to remember something when I was like, what about the functioning of the amygdala? Because the amygdala is a very important part of the brain. It deals with emotions and regulation. We've talked about this a lot in our uploads on the brain of a serial killer, as well as the psychology of serial killers. And I was like, everything I understood about that was, a psychopathic serial killer will have an amygdala that is 17% smaller, on average, of course, 17% smaller than a normal functioning person. Whereas somebody in the exact opposite direction, someone who is very benevolent, someone who is very loving, very charitable and generous, they will have an amygdala that is 8% larger. If you're going to go almost zero psychopathic traits and such, the anti-psychopath, we've also explored that on the channel. What about all of this? And what Christina said to me was, she's like, have you ever held an amygdala in your hand? And I'm like, no, of course not. And she said, the amygdala is part of the brain that is about the size of an almond. It has the texture of hamburger meat, and if you get really close, you can almost sense that it smells like gasoline. Everything in the brain is going to be interlocking. While it is true that a psychopathic or a sociopathic serial killer would have decreased amygdala function, overall, the different portions of the brain would have an increased function. And very specifically, there's an issue that goes on with psychopathic and sociopathic serial killers. It relates to the amygdala and the orbitofrontal cortex. Orbitofrontal cortex, the part of the brain that is right behind the eyes. And with the amygdala, like we said, we're dealing with things all about emotional regulation. But with the front brain, the orbitofrontal cortex, the relationship between these two things is not working appropriately. It is not working correctly. So you're going to have someone who is going to be doing things, being very impulsive, but also not being able to regulate those feelings of guilt, shame, as well as remorse, empathy, grief, all of these things that are happening. So when someone's doing actions, the brain is not registering those things properly, like grief, shame, empathy. These things are not being recorded adequately for someone who is a psychopath or a sociopath. And this can often lead to things like becoming a serial killer, because once again, someone is doing these actions and feeling no remorse. There's another individual out there named Dr. James Fallon who has explored this subject very heavily. He's the author of The Psychopath Inside. And what he has said is that it's almost like someone who is disregarding the law. If you were to imagine right now, standing on a street corner, and you see that sign that says, "Don't walk," and you look to the left, you look to the right, and then you're like, there are no cars coming, there are no people walking by, there's no one to see me, I'm going to cross the street and it says, "Don't walk." You know that perhaps you should not be doing that, but your brain is telling you, hey, that's no big deal, I'm going to do it anyway. So with a psychopath or sociopathic serial killer, so as described by James Fallon, he is saying that perhaps they are experiencing something very similar to that when they are committing a murder. They know that they should not be doing it, but they are giving into that urge or impulse. Or at the end of the day, they are simply thinking that it is not that big of a deal. They know they would get in trouble for it if they got caught. They have a sense of right and wrong. They are aware of that, but at the same time, to them, it isn't that important. They do not feel that that is something that is very much relevant to them, so they're not going to think too much about it, or they aren't going to feel anything if they do this wrong action, even when we're dealing with very heinous things, such as murdering people. And that definitely gets expanded upon certain things, like, as we've said in the past, serial killers will often do things to fuel their own excitement. We're dealing this relationship of brain function doesn't seem to be working, so in many ways, there would be a sense of excitement by doing these things, such as committing murders, or even just knowing that the person that they have murdered will be missed by their loved ones. All of these things can relate to excitement and fuel excitement. And I think it's important to have those discussions because back in 2019, we did an upload called Paris Bennett Debating Psychopath. And in this one, we talked all about how Paris Bennett could be a very good example of a clinical born psychopath, someone who came out of his mother's womb and was a psychopath. And the thing about Paris Bennett is we have so many things about him documented in the media, videography, and all of that. And it was called Debating Psychopath because we were trying to debate, is he or is he not an extreme clinical psychopath from birth? And in that one, I made some comments about how, the psychopath isn't feeling things. And somebody corrected me in the comments section when they were saying, now wait a second. Yes, psychopaths and sociopaths feel things. They definitely feel things I would just give this somewhat of an explanation. You will see this written in a lot of the literature around psychopaths and sociopathic serial killers, that they're blank. When it comes to their conscience, it's blank. When it comes to, as we said, some of these things about guilt and shame, they are blank. But that doesn't mean for a second that they are devoid of all emotions. And after I did that upload on Paris Bennett last year, we did a 3-part series on Ted Bundy where we explored some things associated with him. And by the time I got to that point, we were going through many other true crime cases. It was very clear that, yes, indeed, psychopathic serial killers and sociopaths and narcissists, they all feel lots of different emotions. Because with Ted Bundy, so many things were very well documented. And prior to his execution, he was expressing enormous amounts of fear, enormous amounts of sadness, not for the victims or anything. He was very clear that he was not capable of feeling sympathy. With Ted Bundy, perhaps, it was more just that he was afraid of dying. And there's a very important reason for that we can say in just a minute, but the whole point is, yes, there is feeling that is going on, but I think that it's very important to recognize that the orbitofrontal cortex and the amygdala are not having this proper type of regulation, perhaps due to the decreased size of the amygdala, but the brain is very much interlocking, so you have decision-making with lack of emotion, impulses and control, lack of emotion. I mean, this sounds like it's a recipe for disaster. And this was expanded upon by James Fallon when he was saying very clearly that there are three core components of what happens for someone to become a serial killer. Because what does this mean? Psychopath, sociopath? I mean, we've perhaps laid out a certain case for it, for the definition, but perhaps there are millions of people in the United States of America alone who are psychopaths. I am not joking. Psychopaths or sociopaths, of course. Millions. I mean, like, those figures are not exaggerated. And I would cite the segment that they did on Global News that was talking about this. But the thing that I would just like to say is, according to Dr. James Fallon, he's like, why do some people go on to become serial killers? And there are three major components. Number one, genetics. There is something in their genes. Number two, brain function, like we said about the amygdala and the orbitofrontal cortex not functioning properly. And number three would be child abuse, dealing with unhealed childhood traumas, unprocessed childhood traumas. When these three things come together, the end result is a person is often a serial killer. And this is one of the reasons why many different people respond to things in different ways, and some people go on to kill, whereas some do not. James Fallon has a very interesting story, and you can find lots of his material on YouTube. He's talking about how he was a neuroscientist. He is a neuroscientist, I should say, and he was looking at a scan of his own brain, and it turned out he had many of the neurological features that would be in place for a psychopath. And it turns out that he had a lot of murderers in his own family tree. But the issue was he didn't experience an enormous amount of child abuse growing up, and he didn't experience an enormous amount of childhood trauma. So that was one of the reasons why he did not go on to become a psychopathic serial killer, or sociopathic serial killer, we should say, if we're dealing with someone who has been affected by the social surroundings. So I think, and it's not simply that I think this, it's that the role of child abuse must have a heavy connection to parenting. We're not talking about even an uncle or an aunt or bullies at school or somebody else, perhaps, from a different community organization. The relationship between child and parent seems absolutely fundamental to the process. And oftentimes what happens is, in many of these true crime cases, many of these serial killer cases, what you can see is that a child was betrayed by one of their parents. Even the parent was the one abusing. The mother and father play an enormous role in the psychological buildup of somebody and their thought process and all of these things. Sigmund Freud had many things to say about this, but the problem with Sigmund Freud is maybe he went a little bit too far, and he was all based on the premise that the actions of your parents are going to completely model your sexuality and your aggression. And I mean, you could say things about Freud, you could say things about Carl Jung, about how he went too far, he's too experimental. Everybody's going to have certain areas that they can critique, but I do think there is a fundamental relationship that goes on from parent to child, and when the parents do abusive things to the child, something happens in the brain that leads to a form of the kid is recognizing that they have been betrayed. And you will often find that, well, I guess a good way to put it is Ray Bradbury talked about this in his book Farewell Summer. He's written several things about serial killers, actually, interwoven into his books. We did an upload on this once called Ray Bradbury on serial killers. And what he said was, a serial killer is a child without love being forced to live in an adult body. And I was remembering something about that once, just to share a personal thing. When I was younger, it's like one time I just threw a temper tantrum. I was 4 or 5 years old. I threw a temper tantrum solely because I knew it was going to hurt my father's feelings. Part of it was like an experiment. Let's just kind of confirm my hypothesis. Another part of it was perhaps fueling excitement, maybe treating other people like they're just balls of light and color. I knew that if I did that in a certain way that he would feel really bad, and he went to my mother and he said, "Oh, our son's a monster." And he's saying things like that, and some people grow out of it. Most people grow out of it. And I mean, perhaps if he had beaten me senseless for throwing that tantrum, some things would have been affected differently, and my brain would have been processing that in a different way. But I think what Ray Bradbury was talking about with that was just saying that some people do not escape that phase when they just sort of are going to be doing things that are very impulsive, that are inconsiderate, that are going to have lack of a regard for human life, and they are just going to be doing destructive things because it, number one, fuels the excitement, and number two, it's because they just feel like that there is no recognition of love. A serial killer is a child without love being forced to live in an adult body. Okay, so that is kind of going off on a tangent for a second. And right now I'd like to talk about a different neuroscientist named Kent Keel, who brought up something very interesting. And to give, just some context and such, we've been talking about Joseph D'Angelo, the Golden State Killer, recently on the channel, and we will continue that series later this week. And with D'Angelo, we very frequently mentioned that he had his reign of terror, his period of activity, 1974 to 1986. And we're just like, this was the years of activity. These were the years of activity. Many serial killers have years of activity and years of operation. But one of the things we haven't really mentioned too much is, why does it end? We said one reason, but a reason that was shared by the neuroscientist Kent Keel was that it has to do with a reduction in testosterone. As somebody's testosterone level goes down, and their sexual desires go down, like sexual activity, sex drive, once that begins to decline, the desire to be a serial killer declines. And this is why when someone ends their reign of terror, ends their period of activity being a serial killer, they tend not to restart. They tend not to reactivate. They can, though. Almost definitely can. And I would definitely expect that there would be a correlation to testosterone spikes as opposed to a different type of hormone or neurotransmitter. But yeah, sometimes people do restart this, but on average, it really appears that many people have a long period of activity being a serial killer, and then it just ends. And I do not think it is an accident, something that is furthered by Keel when he also just brought up that 5 out of 6 serial killers are men. I mean, 1 out of 6, I don't think people even think that 1 out of 6 serial killers would be female, but we've mentioned many of them on this channel before, especially when you're getting into people who work as accomplices, whether it's Cindy Hendy or Karla Homolka. I mean, people work as accomplices to help a male serial killer kind of carry out many things, but the whole point is that there is a reduction in testosterone, which often leads to the end activities of the serial killer. It leads to ending their activities. And there's a big reason that I wanted to point this one out with D'Angelo, the Golden State Killer, because one of the things that we're exploring in that discussion is that he perhaps decided not to commit more murders. And this is all theoretical, mind you, because he thought that if he continued to do that, he would get caught. Clear as day. One of the clearest examples. And you're going to find a similar thing that's going on with other serial killers. They stop committing the murders out of fear of getting caught because they have predatory instincts. Number one, it could be the testosterone level. Number two, the sex drive. And number three, it could be the predatory instinct where this person is simply saying that if I continue to do this, I'm going to get arrested and I'm going to go to jail. And their predatory instinct is telling them that they cannot do this anymore. And you could definitely imagine a correlation right now between a decline in testosterone, decline in sexual activity, and a decline in a desire to even risk going to jail. But so I can see how all of that would come together. Then the only thing that I would like to say just in conclusion is that you're going to be dealing with different people who have different types of brains. Not everyone is going to produce a complete textbook result. It's really not just putting all of these ingredients together and then, all right, you can pull this thing out of the oven and then voila, there it is. Absolutely not. As people, we are very different. And if you listen to what James Fallon said about how his brain could have very easily gone on to become the brain of a serial killer, but he did not because of his social environment and surroundings. Absolutely, we can see how all of these things are lining up. So what I would say is that when we're dealing with the brain functions of a serial killer, definitely things associated with impulse control, as well as association with the lack of certain types of emotions, especially feelings of empathy, as we said, grief, and remorse. An interesting thing that I heard about narcissists was in the past, and this, I would cite Dr. Ramani and her YouTube channel for this one, is when she said narcissists are more likely to experience public emotions such as shame, guilt, and embarrassment, things that people would experience publicly. These are the things that they are really trying to avoid, and these are the things that that they don't really want to happen, because they actually use narcissism as a way to try and avoid embarrassment, humiliation, and shame, and certain public emotions and experiences. But I think that's where we're going to have to leave it for now. And what do you have to say about serial killers? What do you have to say about psychopaths, sociopaths, and narcissists? What do you have to say about any of the people we mentioned? D'Angelo, the Golden State Killer, Ted Bundy, as well as perhaps any other serial killer that you can think of that comes to mind, or other murderers like Paris Bennett. If you have anything to say at all, please drop a comment in the section below. I would love to hear from you. And please visit our upload on the psychology of serial killers, which will talk more about the social elements involved. And if you like this upload, you can hit the like button. It really helps out the channel. See you on Instagram for the bonus podcast. Until next time.